So today I'm going to talk about the next era of workplace well-being. So I think it's pretty obvious for anyone that's been paying attention that throughout the pandemic, well-being started to emerge even more than before the pandemic as one of the most critical points in the employee experience. And I think what we're starting to see is this evolution of things happen outside of work, stuff goes on in society, and that influences the decisions we make as employers. And we're definitely seeing that obviously at the moment with the cost of living crisis. So we're starting to see that actually as society changes and as society struggles with some of those changes, those well-being decisions are being pushed on employers. And obviously the decision taken by the US Supreme Court this week is an influence of that. So you start to see employers are making well-being decisions where the state perhaps isn't doing that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of workplace well-being today and kind of the journey that we've been on and actually where we're at the moment and some of the challenges we've got with trying to measure effectiveness of workplace well-being. So for those that don't know me, I'm Chief Innovation Officer for Benefex, but I'm also a psychologist and a HR author. Made a few different influencer lists. I paid the right people, sponsored the right events, got my name on a few lists. But I guess what's most important to what we're going to talk about today is I chair Wellbeing for Engaged Success, the government-backed movement that was set up 10 years ago by the then Secretary of State. I'm also a key stakeholder in developing wellbeing KPIs for the Rail Safety Standards Board and the Department of Transport. And so all of that knowledge and experience, hopefully over the last couple of years, has started to create what I'm going to talk to you about now. So we've been heavily involved in creating these kind of wellbeing KPIs in the workplace. Lots of the research I'm going to cover today as well is available in this report, Great Expectations, that's been produced by Benefex. So if you go to our stand downstairs, you can just scan the QR code and get sent a digital version of that. I recommend you download it. It plays a lot into the we surveyed, I think, 4,000 people globally. We surveyed a couple of hundred reward and benefit directors around the world and got their views on what are the expectations that are changing and how do we match those expectations. But as we've started to see, as I mentioned, we've started to see that the employee experience is now dominated by well-being. So in almost every conversation I have with an employer, well-being is dominating that conversation. So when I wrote my first book in 2016, I said that I thought well-being was the most important part of the employee experience, and I think that's definitely happened now, certainly buoyed by the pandemic. And so when we look at all those other different parts of the employee experience, diversity, inclusion, sustainability, the things that customers have been telling us are really important to the employee experience, well-being still comes out on top. So our research found that 96% said the employee experience generally is now important now than it was before the pandemic. 71% told us that commitment to well-being was now very important to their organisation. A massive 99% said well-being was a top priority. I don't know who that 1% was, but there's always a dissenting voice in every survey. And what we found when we crunched all the data of all the benefit schemes that we run around the world, that actually the top 8 global benefits were all employee well-being related. So we're starting to see that actually when it came to the crunch, when it came to the pandemic, it was benefit schemes that people were going to for this well-being support and where they expected to see lots of this well-being support as well. But really surprisingly, I think, the biggest result for me out of this whole survey was that 92% of employees around the world told us that well-being was now the #1 priority when they're looking for a job. So in this very challenging recruitment and retention environment, what we're finding is that actually people are worried more about how you support their well-being than any other part of that kind of reward and benefits feature. So really, really interesting to see. I think as we start to kind of deal with the Great Resignation, whatever comes next, we're starting to show that actually well-being is going to start to feature more heavily as part of that employee value proposition. So if I'm going to come and work with you, that's part of the deal now is how are you going to take care of me? And some of the things I mentioned at the start are going to play into that. So if I'm a woman in America and you've got employees in America, how are you going to support me if I need to make an abortion decision, for example? In the UK or many parts of the world, if we're going through cost of living crisis and I'm struggling to make ends meet, I'm turning to my employer for this support because I don't tend to be getting it elsewhere. And so I think that's really, really important for all of us to note that actually well-being is driving the vast majority of the decisions that employees are making about how they value what you do for them and why they would want to come and work with you in the first place. And so what we started to see is as more and more customers that we work with around the world have started to be committed to employee well-being, we've kind of gone through this period of time where at the start of the pandemic, it felt like lots of employers scrambled to find the fire extinguisher and read the instructions and to kind of put out the fire of the pandemic. And what we've ended up with is lots of people I speak to who panic bought stuff And I have a lot of sympathy with that because we needed to help people during the pandemic. So a lockdown hit and people bought mental health apps and people bought financial well-being tools and all this kind of stuff. And 2 years later, we almost feel like lots of employers are now in this space where they're taking a breath and thinking, okay, we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic, depending on who you speak to. But we're at the situation now where, did the things I buy actually, were they effective? Were they a worthwhile investment? What are the usage stats? What's the feedback I'm getting from employees? And how's that going to inform the next thing I do? How's that going to inform the next 5 years as we go through the rest of the cost of living crisis, probably a recession, and whilst we're still dealing with the kind of echo pandemic of the mental health effects of the pandemic. So I think all that stuff is kind of boiled now, that as the pandemic's kind of coming to an end, people are taking stock, taking a breath and thinking, okay, so what was effective and how do we measure that effectiveness? But we've got some problems here because actually when you look at all the research and all the evidence around measuring well-being, it's pretty problematic. So nobody seems to do it really well. Nobody seems to do it in an agreed fashion. And some of the things that, you know, I'm being slightly critical of some of the providers in the room, but some of the data that you get out of some of the wellbeing providers that many of you might use, I don't think is really telling us what's going on in an organisation. And so when I was trying to explain this to my dad recently, this was the analogy that came into my head. And I was trying to explain to him that, you know, if you had a shop and 1,000 people a day came into your shop but nobody bought anything, does that really tell you if you've got a successful shop or not? And so I think we start to see that with lots of the data we get from lots of wellbeing apps. Lots of traffic does not make engagement. And so what we're starting to see is that people will open emails, but they won't click through to platforms. And that, to me, isn't engagement. So I was with a customer on Monday, or yesterday, and they told me that they had this mental health app that they're using that had 89% engagement rate, is what they told us. And then they found out that actually the emails that were being sent to employees that had opted in were being stopped by their kind of spam filter in IT and being held for a couple of hours before being released. But that was telling the provider that was an open rate. And so actually they thought for a couple of years they've had an 89% open rate when actually it's been far less than that. And the worrying thing is they will never know the truth. They will never actually be able to work out how many people actually open those emails. And so I think when we think about engagement, we can't use those old metrics of does somebody download it, does somebody log into it. That doesn't necessarily tell us if people are using it effectively or if it's actually solving a problem for us. So when you see data that says 21% of your people logged in and spent an average of 3 minutes on a platform, does that really tell you anything about the impact you've had on their well-being? And I think one of the other problems we've got is that the research is really in its infancy. So what we're starting to see is that a lot of criticism in the literature, especially the academic literature, exists around the validity of the way that we measure well-being in work. So even some of the really common ways that we measure well-being, and even some of the state ones, so the Office for National Statistics and their well-being measure, it comes under a lot of criticism from some of the experts. And there's no universally agreed way of measuring employee well-being, despite the advances we've seen over the last couple of years. And one study I read that looked at 42 different ways globally of measuring well-being that are used by lots of state and employers, found that actually there were quite significant difference in arguments between all of those different 42 measures. And so the researchers conclude that actually, even across those 42 different measures, it didn't really tell us anything about how do we measure well-being. And a separate study that looked at 100 different measures around the world of measuring employee well-being found that actually most of those, around 90%, were created between 1990 and 1999. So again, lots of the ways that we measure workplace well-being is actually out of date. And I would even say if you created something in 2018 because of the effect that the pandemic had, even that kind of stuff would probably be a little bit out of date. And obviously, one of the biggest problems with well-being is we've still failed to define what well-being is. There is still no universally agreed definition of well-being. Most definitions of well-being actually just describe what well-being is rather than define it, and I think that's a problem. I think if we start to create a really comprehensive list of all the things that affect employee well-being in the workplace, there's going to be an awful lot of crossover, and that starts to make it difficult for us to measure. So we know that financial strain can cause mental health problems. We know those people who've got serious mental health problems can fall into debt. So all these things kind of play off each other and start to tell us that actually even finding some of the root causes can be really, really difficult in the workplace. And I think our industry has become pretty good at treating the symptoms, not the causes of well-being at work. And so we don't seem to be trying to solve the problem at the root. We wait until people are in this point of crisis, and then we give them access to an app or a platform that will hopefully kind of solve that problem for us. And it also does nothing for the fact that only around 50% of our well-being can actually be changed by modifiable health behaviour changes. And so actually the way we're brought up, the way society treats us, the way people feel marginalised, all of that stuff contributes to poor mental health. So actually as employers, I think we need to understand and be honest with ourselves that we can't solve a lot of these problems, and maybe we shouldn't be solving some of these problems. And if somebody works with you and they've got depression or a serious mental health condition, there's very little you're going to be able to solve that problem for that person. You're only really able to support them through that existing challenge. And when we look at all the evidence around what causes poor well-being at work, we start to see that it's stuff like, is my opinion courted and is my opinion valued? Do you communicate with transparency? Can I trust my manager? Does my manager have regular one-to-ones with me? Do I get recognised for a job well done? Right the way down to really intricate things like if you offer zero-hour contracts, that instability drives a lot of poor well-being. If you don't pay the living wage, that drives a lot of poor financial well-being in your workplace. And we don't tend to measure those when we look at workplace well-being. And you might have come across things, objective and subjective measures. They get talked about quite a lot in this space. So I think when we looked at well-being, when I first got into the well-being market, we were traditionally measuring success by objective measures like turnover and absence rates. But we now know from research from the CIPD that around 95% of people who suffered with their poor mental health phoned in sick and lied about the reason why they were off sick. So they pretended they had the flu or migraine rather than reveal their poor mental health problem. And actually, for lots of us, you leave businesses for a wide variety of complex reasons. So actually staying with a business or leaving doesn't necessarily tell you anything about how we support people's well-being. But when we look at what is really important, I think it's to ask people how they feel. And I sometimes feel like if we're asking people how they feel about the support they get at work, that is sometimes arguably more important than what we're actually doing. If we can give people the feeling that their employer will be there for them if they need it, if they feel like they're supported in the workplace, I think that's sometimes more important than those different things we could buy or put in place. And what we're starting to see as well is that subjective measures, so asking people how they feel, asking people their opinions and views, are becoming more and more used by government, state, and is informing policy. So really interestingly, lots of economists are now starting to use subjective measures, asking people how they feel. And this is really interesting when you think about things like financial well-being, because it's got far less to do with how much money you've got in the bank and what your income is than actually how in control you feel of your financial situation. So I've got friends who could put £500 on a credit card and will lose sleep over it and get distracted at work and their productivity will suffer. I've got friends that will use credit card balances to buy deposits on houses and balance like 3 different properties. I've got a friend who does this. It's like spinning plates, and it would stress me out. But for him, he feels in control. So he's carrying a lot of debt. He looks like he's financially insecure, but he wouldn't tell you that he was. And so I think some of this stuff is really important to find out, how do you feel about your current situation? What's important to you? What more could we be doing for you? And also what we start to see is that this really plays to this hedonic way that we look at well-being in the workplace. So what's important to you? What can we do for you right now? How can we make you feel better? That kind of stuff comes out more in subjective than objective measures. And I think the good news is that pretty much all of you in the room are likely already probably doing this. So you probably have some kind of survey. It doesn't necessarily have to be a well-being survey. You might have an employee engagement survey where you're asking people their opinions and you're courting those views from employees. And so I think that is already a really good way of actually measuring how you're doing well-being. So there are very close links between engagement and well-being. I think when you get high engagement levels, if your engagement scores are high and people are telling you they're very engaged in work, that can pretty much tell us whether people feel well or happy with the support that you offer at work as well. So I think that's really important. And what we've been doing is, over the last couple of months, we've been spending lots of time with loads of global employers looking at well-being in the workplace. And one of the questions I ask people all the time is, does your employer care about you? And again, I think the really important question to ask your people, how do they feel about the support that's in place? How do they feel about the stuff that you've put in there? So this is the kind of question that comes out quite a lot of similar questions in surveys. But I think it really gets to the heart of what are we trying to do, what problems are we trying to solve, and importantly, how do people think about the support that we're giving? For the sake of time, I'll skip through some of these, but we can make these slides available to you. But effectively what we're looking at, I think, is this is a psychologist's view. So effectively what we're looking at is how do people feel about their life? How are they kind of satisfied with their life? How do they rate their own well-being? And so effectively what we're looking at here is hedonic balance. So are people feeling that kind of positivity at work? We're minimizing negative emotions, we're kind of accentuating the positive. life satisfaction, so their own view of how well they are and how satisfied they are with their life, and that kind of sense of mastery and autonomy that we can give them at work, that really plays a big part in employee well-being. And so we're trying to look at how people experience their lives, not the objective facts. The objective fact would be you've got high income, ergo your financial well-being must be well. But actually we know at the moment, through the cost of living crisis in this country, 36% of people earning over £100,000 say they're stressed by their finances at the moment. So we really need to kind of get to how do people feel about the support that we do. And so we've got a poll, but I think I'm probably going to run out of time to be able to do the poll. But I think the questions we should be asking ourselves as employers are, what do you do to support your people in the workplace? How do they value that? And how do you compare? So this is a really interesting one. This has come out with a lot of the sessions that I've run with employers over the last couple of years. We've done about 150 different separate workshops with large employers around the world. And what we started to find is actually nobody really knows what good looks like. So even from an employer point of view, on this list of all the things that you do to support your people in the workplace, what is good? What does good look like? So what are the things that every employer should be doing? What does the evidence say that if you do or don't do these things, it will affect employee well-being? And so we've launched something called the Wellbeing Progress Index. So we've taken all of that learning and put it into an online tool for all our kind of customers and prospects to be able to go in. And so what we've effectively done is taken 4 years worth of research to look at what does the evidence say that if an employer does or doesn't do this thing, it will impact employee well-being. And so what things can we put in place that mean your subjective well-being scores are going to go up, your engagement scores, your employee survey will go up. And so what we've been able to do is benchmark you in a number of different categories where we know well-being affects employees, so not just the reward and benefits that you offer, not just the platforms, but how do you train your managers? What role do managers play in the welfare of staff? The way you communicate and how often you communicate, right the way down to how often should you be sending out these surveys? What's too frequent? What's not frequent enough? We followed all the evidence to effectively create a set of around 200 questions that will benchmark you against your region, so globally in your region, the industry that you work in, employers of a similar size, and importantly, show you where you're underperforming compared to the global group. So actually what you'll be able to then do is start to find out, what do I need to do next? What are the things I should be offering that maybe I'm not offering? And some examples we've got about how this works in reality. So we know that when private medical is offered through the pandemic, it was one of the key indicators of somebody not developing poor mental health globally was that they had it just available to them. So just having health insurance in place, the evidence was telling us people felt more supported and weathered the storm of the pandemic. We know that when you have inadequate communications, that drives poor well-being. When people don't feel like you're being honest with them, when you're not communicating with them regularly. We saw in the pandemic that in the first lockdown in the UK, 2/3 of employee engagement scores went up across the country. And I think that's because we started to do the things that we should have always been doing. Our CEO was very honest and open with our people. We got on weekly calls and we got on Zoom calls, and everyone was really kind of transparent and supportive. And I think that drives some of those engagement scores. And we also know that using recognition tools and getting recognised regularly at work has an impact on well-being. One study I read found that actually fathers' relationships with their kids was better the more regularly they got recognised at work. So we're starting to see the impact is far greater than the workplace when we do some of these things. So what we think every employer should be doing is benchmarking. So we think you should get an idea of how do you compare to others. Taking an evidence-based view, I think evidence of efficacy in the well-being space is few and far between. If you look at some of the data around the most popular, even the big American tools that are used by providers and employers in the States, lack of evidence is a pretty common factor when we look at well-being at work. So let's take all that evidence and show you what actually things can you do are going to have a material impact on the well-being of your people. Track your progress over time, so see yourself hopefully getting better, and also giving you that view of, okay, so what can you do about it? So we're launching that in a couple of months. For those of you that have read my book or have heard me talk about the book, I mean, I've talked about it an awful lot, so I would expect people to have heard about it. It was on LinkedIn an awful lot when it came out. Good news about this is I'm going to stop talking about this book, and I'm going to start talking about this one. So what we've been able to do is take all of that evidence, put that into a book which Benefex has created, and that summarises all the things that the evidence says employers need to do to be effective at employee well-being. Along with the progress index, you'll be able to understand why those questions, important questions to answer yourself, and importantly, why do we think that is going to solve the problem for you. And it's also a moving target. So we will keep up to date with all the research, we'll keep these things moving along, because well-being doesn't get completed. There's no kind of end point to this well-being, it's a moving target, and so we're trying to kind of keep up with all the evidence as it emerges. And so if you want to kind of take a look at this and have a chat with us, come to our stand. We'll gladly take you through it. If you want to give us your details, we'll send you a copy of the book when that's published in the next 2 months. And I thank you very much for your time. And sorry I had to skip through some of the slides, but thank you.